Open your bathroom cabinet and count how many things are in there. Shampoo, sunscreen, deodorant, moisturizer, maybe makeup. Now, here's a number worth sitting with. The European Union currently bans or restricts more than 1,600 individual chemical substances from use in cosmetics and personal care products. The United States, under federal law, has banned or restricted around a dozen. That's not a typo, and it's not a close comparison. It's roughly 100-to-1 gap between the two regulatory systems on the exact same category of product sold under many of the exact same brand names on both sides of the Atlantic. But, and this is important because we don't do one-directional stories on this channel. There's one entire category inside personal care where the United States is actually years, sometimes over a decade, behind Europe in the opposite way. Not too permissive, but too slow to approve things that are already sitting on European shelves. We'll get there. Let's start with the bigger, stranger number first. The EU's cosmetics framework is called the Cosmetics Regulation, formerly EC number 1223/2009, and it works on what is called a negative list system, meaning it starts from an assumption that ingredients are fine to use unless specifically added to a prohibited or restricted list, but that list gets updated constantly as new safety data comes in, and once something is added, it applies EU-wide immediately. The current banned and restricted list runs past 1,600 substances, covering categories like certain formaldehyde-releasing preservatives, specific parabens, several synthetic musks, and a range of substances flagged as potential endocrine disruptors or carcinogens based on EU scientific committee reviews. The United States system works almost the opposite way. Under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, cosmetics historically did not require Food and Drug Administration pre-market approval at all. Companies could formulate and sell a product without submitting it for federal safety review first. Similar in spirit to the structure and function claims we covered a few videos back, just applied to the ingredients themselves rather than the marketing claims. The Food and Drug Administration could only intervene after a product was already on shelves and causing documented harm. That changed somewhat in 2022 when Congress passed the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act, MOCRA, which gave the Food and Drug Administration modestly expanded authority, mandatory facility registration, adverse event reporting, and a requirement that the Food and Drug Administration finally establish limits for specific ingredients like the formaldehyde-releasing preservatives and certain PFAS chemicals. But even with that update, the federal list of explicitly banned cosmetic ingredients remains in the range of about a dozen substances, nowhere close to closing the gap with the European Union's list. It's worth pausing on why the United States never built a European Union-style pre-market cosmetic approval system in the first place, because it's not simply that American regulators care less. Historically, cosmetics were considered a lower-risk product category than food or drugs under United States law on the reasoning that most cosmetic exposure is external, topical, and short duration rather than ingested or injected. That reasoning made more sense in an era of simpler formulations than it does today, when the average adult in the United States uses somewhere around a dozen personal care products daily, each containing anywhere from a handful to several dozen individual ingredients, adding up to genuinely substantial, cumulative daily exposure across a person's skin, the largest organ in the human body. The European Union's more comprehensive regulatory build-out partly reflects a reassessment of that same underlying assumption, deciding that cumulative, repeated topical exposure across a person's lifetime deserved a regulatory framework closer to food than the lighter touch system cosmetics originally received. Let's look at a specific example that shows exactly how this plays out in a real product category: parabens. Parabens are a family of preservatives used in cosmetics and personal care products for decades, prized because they are cheap and effective at preventing bacterial and fungal growth in water-based formulas. In 2014, following a scientific review flagging potential endocrine disrupting effects, EU banned 5 specific parabens outright across all cosmetic products: isopropyl paraben, isobutylparaben, phenylparaben, benzylparaben, and pentylparaben, while placing tighter concentration limits on several others that remain permitted, including restrictions specifically for products intended for children under 3. In the US, none of those 5 parabens are federally banned. They remain legal cosmetic ingredients, subject only to the general not adulterated standard under the FD&C Act, which in practice means the FDA has never established that current typical use concentrations pose a proven safety risk, rather than the EU's precautionary approach of restricting first based on suggestive rather than conclusive evidence. You will find plenty of American products proudly labeled paraben-free as a marketing choice, which tells you something interesting on its own. Consumer demand has pushed voluntary reformulation in the US market, the exact same pattern we saw with bread additives and RBST-free milk, well ahead of and independent from any federal requirement forcing the change. Formaldehyde-releasing preservatives follow a similar arc. Ingredients like DMDM-hydantoin and quaternium-15 work by slowly releasing small amounts of formaldehyde over time to keep a product's water content from growing bacteria. Formaldehyde itself is classified by IARC as a known human carcinogen, though the exposure level from a preservative slowly releasing trace amounts in a rinse-off shampoo is a very different risk profile than occupational exposure to concentrated formaldehyde, and regulators on both sides of the Atlantic have generally treated the two very differently rather than banning trace-release preservatives outright. The EU permits these preservatives, but requires a specific warning label that must say contains formaldehyde on any product where free formaldehyde exceeds a set concentration threshold, giving consumers direct notice on the package. The US has no equivalent labeling requirement. A product can contain a formaldehyde-releasing preservative with no on-package disclosure beyond the ingredient name itself buried in the ingredient list, which most shoppers wouldn't recognize as a formaldehyde-releasing compound without specifically looking it up. Now, the twist. Sunscreen. This is the one category in personal care where the roles genuinely flip, and it comes down to a quirk of American regulatory classification that most people have never heard of. In the United States, sunscreen is not regulated as a cosmetic at all. It is regulated as an over-the-counter drug, which means any new active ingredient has to go through the FDA's drug approval pathway, a substantially slower, more expensive process than the EU's cosmetic ingredient framework, which treats UV filters as cosmetic ingredients, subject to the same negative list system as everything else we have discussed. The practical result is that several sunscreen active ingredients that have been safely used across Europe and Asia for 15, 20, in some cases close to 30 years remain unapproved for use in the US. Tinosorb S and Tinosorb M, two broad-spectrum UV filters widely used in European and Asian sunscreen formulations and generally regarded by dermatologists as offering excellent, stable, broad-spectrum protection, have never received FDA approval for the US market. Mexeril, a UV filter developed decades ago and used in sunscreens across Europe since the 1990s, only became available in the US in a limited licensed formulation years after it was already standard in French pharmacies. In 2014, Congress passed the Sunscreen Innovation Act specifically to try to speed up the FDA's backlog on these pending applications, and progress has still been slow, with several of these filters continuing to sit in unresolved regulatory limbo years after Europe's dermatology and cosmetic chemistry communities settled the safety question. This means that a European sunscreen, in many documented comparisons by dermatologists and cosmetic chemists, is capable of formulations that a US-made sunscreen legally cannot replicate, not because American cosmetic scientists don't know how, but because the specific molecule required is still sitting in an FDA drug approval queue. It is a genuinely strange case where the OTC drug classification, meant to add a layer of safety scrutiny, has functioned instead as a bottleneck that has kept Americans behind on sunscreen technology that has been standard everywhere else in the developed world for a generation. There are two more categories worth understanding because they show this is not just about a handful of individual banned chemicals, it is about two entirely different philosophies for regulating chemicals as a whole. The first is PFAS, sometimes called forever chemicals because of how slowly they break down in the environment and in the human body. PFAS compounds have been used in cosmetics for their water-resistant and long-wearing properties. They show up in some waterproof mascaras, long-wear foundations, and certain lip products. The EU has been moving toward a sweeping restriction on PFAS as a class, not one chemical at a time, through its broader chemical regulation framework called REACH, which stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. The European Chemicals Agency has been evaluating a proposal that would restrict roughly 10,000 different PFAS compounds across a huge range of product categories, cosmetics included, treating the entire chemical family as a single regulatory unit rather than requiring individual proof of harm for each one. In the US, MoCRA's 2022 update gave the FDA a mandate to study PFAS in cosmetics specifically, but that's a research directive, not a restriction. There is currently no federal ban on PFAS in US cosmetic products, and any action remains at the study and report stage rather than the prohibition stage. That difference points to something bigger than cosmetics specifically. The EU's REACH framework, first adopted in 2006, requires manufacturers to register any chemical produced or imported above roughly 1 ton per year, and in many cases to demonstrate safety data before it can be used at all. Again, the negative list logic, but applied to industrial chemistry broadly, not just cosmetics. The US equivalent is the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, originally passed in 1976 and for decades criticized by environmental health researchers as one of the weakest major chemical safety laws in the industrialized world, in part because it grandfathered in tens of thousands of chemicals already in commercial use in 1976 without requiring any of them to be individually reassessed. TSCA was reformed in 2016 to give the EPA somewhat more authority to evaluate existing chemicals, but the agency still works through a substance-by-substance review process, facing an enormous backlog rather than REACH's broader registration-first model. This is really the structural root of almost everything we've covered on this channel so far. Bromate, ADA, RBST, the cosmetics list, all of it traces back to these two fundamentally different starting assumptions about who has to prove what before a chemical reaches your bathroom shelf or your dinner table. The second category is microplastics, and this one is a genuinely recent development worth knowing about. In 2023, the European Chemicals Agency finalized a restriction on intentionally added microplastics across a wide range of products, including the tiny plastic exfoliating beads once common in facial scrubs and body washes, as well as glitter used in some cosmetic products, with a phased implementation timeline running through the rest of this decade. The US restriction in this space is narrower and older. The Microbead-Free Waters Act, passed in 2015, banned plastic microbeads specifically in rinse-off cosmetic products intended to exfoliate or cleanse, which addressed the specific facial scrub controversy that made headlines at the time, but does not extend to the broader range of intentionally added microplastics, including cosmetic glitter and certain long-wear formulation ingredients that the EU's more recent and more comprehensive restriction covers. So here's where all of this leaves you, standing in a personal care aisle. For parabens and formaldehyde-releasing preservatives, the checks are straightforward. Read the ingredient list for the 5 parabens specifically banned by the EU by name, or look for paraben-free labeling if you'd rather not check individual names. For formaldehyde-releasing preservatives, look for DMDM hydantoin, quaternium-15, imidazolidinylurea, or diazolidinylurea specifically. None of them are illegal in the US, but knowing the names lets you make the same choice the EU regulation makes for you automatically through its labeling requirement. One more practical wrinkle worth knowing about synthetic musks, since they show up in an enormous range of products without most people ever noticing them by name. Musks like galaxolide and tonalide are used as fragrance ingredients in a huge share of perfumes, lotions, and laundry products, prized for their long-lasting, subtle, floral musk base note. Some synthetic musks have been flagged in EU environmental and human biomonitoring studies as bioaccumulative, meaning they build up in fatty tissue over time rather than breaking down and clearing the body, and several have been restricted or placed under increased scrutiny within the EU's broader REACH framework as a result. In the US, fragrance ingredients occupy a uniquely opaque corner of cosmetic regulation. The word fragrance or parfum on an ingredient list can legally represent a proprietary blend of dozens of individual chemical components that the manufacturer isn't required to disclose individually at all, protected as a trade secret under US law. The EU takes a meaningfully different approach here too, requiring specific disclosure of a list of common fragrance allergens above a set concentration threshold, even within an otherwise protected fragrance blend. That means a European ingredient label may actually tell you more about what's in a product's fragrance than the identical product's US label does, simply because of how differently the two systems treat trade secret protection versus consumer disclosure. For sunscreen specifically, this is one case where buy the European version isn't just an aesthetic preference. Dermatologists have pointed to genuinely better UVA protection and more elegant, less greasy formulations available overseas, purely as a function of which filters are legally available to formulate with, not because European chemists are more skilled. If you've ever wondered why a sunscreen you loved on a trip to Paris or Seoul isn't sold in the US, now you know exactly why, and it has nothing to do with safety concerns running in the direction you'd assume. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including EU Cosmetics Regulation EC 123/2009, FDA guidance and MOCRA documentation, and IARC classifications. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and isn't medical advice. Regulations and approved ingredient lists change over time, so always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're going outside to the pesticides sprayed on American crops that the EU banned specifically to protect bees. Subscribe if you want to see exactly what that ban was based on and why it hasn't happened here.